Well, good afternoon. This is Josh Haast with the Hawk Migration Association of North America. We're so glad you're with us today for yet another in our Lunch and Learn program series. So thank you for being with us. And just as a means to kind of kick off before I turn it over to my partner in crime, Julie Brown, I would like to just share a few things about HMANA and some of the great work that we're doing, but also share a few things related administratively to using Zoom, to get the best out of this program today. So thanks for being such a great HMANA supporter. Some of you know of a lot of the great work that we're doing, especially from how we use migration site data through the use of hawkcount.org, kind of our flagship website for sharing hawk migration data. If you're not familiar with Hawk Count, please go visit hawkcount.org and take a look at that data. You can find migration sites near you or where you might be traveling, learn about the data, whether they contribute to things like the raptor population index, among other things. That's very informational. So please check that out. In addition to that, go ahead and check out HMANA.org, especially the support page. You can learn about some of the great programs we're doing. Right now, it's Raptorthon season, so that's a great way to support folks that you know in conservation that are raising money and funds, not only for HMANA, but also their local migration site. So check out the Raptorthon area. We've got some great tours planned in the future, one of which to Belize in Central America. So check that out as well. And with having said that, check out our support page with lots of ways that you can donate, but also become a member and join our kettle. So take advantage of that. This program today is just one example where we're able to bring in great speakers, spend the time to create the content for you, and present that on a monthly basis. So thanks for your support. And having said that, I think administratively, if you're struggling with the way things look in Zoom, just please go up to your upper right-hand corner and there's a little button called View. You can click on that and tailor your view to what looks best for you. Most importantly for today, over the next hour, we want you to engage with us. So please pop open that chat window at the bottom of your screen. Not only ask questions through the chat window, also tell us where you're dialing in from. Where's your closest raptor migration site? Or maybe, spring migrations is hot, it's on right now. Tell us what birds you're seeing. But also for nearing the end of Hardy's program today, Julie will facilitate the Q&A side of things. So please, if you have any questions, feel free to add those to the chat. All right, so Julie, I will hand things over to you to introduce our speaker today.
Great, thank you, Josh. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming today. My name is Julie Brown, and I'm the Raptor Migration and Programs Director at HMANA. I have actually seen a couple osprey just this morning migrating over my house, so that's my most recent sighting. We're really excited to have Hardy here speaking to us today to help us kind of get a better understanding of what is being done to protect birds, raptors, from threats like pesticides, rodenticides, and what we can do to help. I know this HMANA audience is very engaged, so I'm excited to hear what Hardy has to say. And Hardy Kern is the Director of Government Relations for the American Bird Conservancy's Pesticide and Birds Campaign. Hardy is an avid birder with a passion for conservation and politics. He holds a BS in Zoology from The Ohio State University and a Master's of Public Administration from Kent State University. He also volunteers as a wildlife rehabilitator with the Ohio Wildlife Center. And he has been working also with HMANA's Education and Conservation Committee to facilitate an ongoing collaboration between HMANA and ABC. We have supported several of ABC's initiatives with letters of support, signing on and to some petitions to help protect raptors. So we look forward to continuing that relationship, working with ABC as they develop position statements on pesticides and rodenticides. So it's all yours, Hardy. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Julie and Josh, and thank you everyone for tuning in today, for watching the recording afterward, for showing an interest in this topic. It's not quite as exciting sounding as getting a field biologist in sometimes, but I think it's a very interesting side of conservation. So yeah, like Julie said, I am the Director of Government Relations for American Bird Conservancy. And basically all that means is it sounds very fancy and illustrious, but I sit on our policy team. And American Bird Conservancy, if you're not familiar with us, we operate across both North, Central, and South America. We operate reserve networks. We do habitat restoration. The vast majority of our staff is field biologists and field technicians that are actively restoring seabird, land bird, you name it, shorebird habitat, or that are doing active survey data, writing scientific papers. But then there's a small but very scrappy and tenacious group of us that work on policy and some of the more amorphous threats to birds. And by that, I mean collisions with glass and windows, renewable energy, and trying to get it sited so that it is, advantageous for people looking for alternative fuel sources, but also as safe as possible for birds, especially for raptors. And then we have one of my coworkers, we call him the most hated man in America because his entire policy portfolio is trying to convince people to keep their cats inside. So he gets a lot of hate mail. But my specific policy portfolio focuses on chemical threats to birds, mostly from environmental contamination of pesticides and lead toxicity. And that's what I want to talk about today, is a different side of conservation from the field work and the biology, and getting a little more wonky, but I'd like to think it's interesting, and I hope I make it interesting for you all as well. So we hear the word advocacy a lot, and advocacy is one of those words that before I worked in it, I didn't really know what it meant either. So most people think like this gull, it's just, yelling at people. And granted, that's part of what I do. But really, it is grassroots organizing. It's getting interested groups together to, unite behind a common cause. Formal comments on government procedures. So that might be laws, rules, regulations, court decisions that have a public comment period. By law, the United States government has to review all substantive formal comments submitted on its proceedings. So that's a great vehicle to make your voice heard. I meet with legislators at the federal and state level. I engage in a lot of educational efforts, talking to groups like this, writing a lot of op-ed pieces, position statements, the things that Julie was referring to earlier, and then also finding creative ways to engage. So we're this year actually not only going to be looking at laws that talk about agricultural pesticides, but we're also funding a program for farmers to buy seed that's not coated with pesticides. We're not only advocating for the use of fewer chemical rodenticides, we're actually going to be supporting research of a new compound, well, it's not new, but a compound called sodium nitrite, which can be used as a biological killing agent, but the way it operates does not bioaccumulate, meaning if sodium nitrite was adapted for rat control, it would kill the rodent without being a threat to any raptors that might come across that rodent. So we're trying to do anything and everything we can to help lessen the threat of toxic pesticides and toxic heavy metals like lead to wild birds. The other big part of my job is legislation. And when I was a kid in school, we watched the Schoolhouse Rock video with I'm Just a Bill. And I had this very Pollyanna-ish idea of how a bill becomes a law, where it's introduced, it's debated, and then the governor, the president, whomever signs it. This graphic is the best visual representation I've been able to find of how a bill actually becomes a law. So it is a very, very complex, weird process. But here's who I am, this little waving figure, the lobbyist. We hear the word lobbyist and we immediately think of, corrupt people that are throwing money at politicians for nefarious purposes. Don't get me wrong, there are those lobbyists out there, but I am a registered lobbyist. I like to think of ABC as part of the bird lobby, the small but powerful bird lobby. And being a lobbyist just means that we can provide expert testimony. We can talk with legislators, with their staff, We can write bills. We can introduce legislation. American Bird Conservancy is actually co-sponsoring a bill in the state of California right now. And me being a registered lobbyist allows me to do that. So lobbying can go both ways, but it really opens up a lot of different processes. So moving away from the process and getting into some of the discrete threats that I work on, the first thing I want to talk about is the threat of lead toxicity to birds. And there are two species of bird that really illustrate the discrete threats really well. One is the California condor, which is most threatened right now in the wild by ingestion of spent lead ammunition. And the other one is the common loon, which is heavily threatened by ingestion of lead-based fishing tackle. And the first thing that I want to say here is we are not anti-hunting. I do not want to vilify sports people. Hunters and anglers are kind of the bedrock of environmental conservation in the United States. They play such an important role. However, lead ammunition and lead fishing tackle do pose threats to wildlife and the people who use them as well. So we aren't saying that, we're against hunting and fishing. We would just like to see it done without the use of lead-based products. So there are a lot of past government actions around lead toxicity as it relates to wildlife. The biggest one came in 1991 when lead ammunition was banned across the country for hunting waterfowl. You cannot hunt ducks, geese, or swans anywhere in the US using lead ammunition. That was a huge win, and it came from active environmentalists, concerned citizen science groups, noticing an effect on waterfowl and especially on bald eagles from ingesting a lot of spent lead. In 2009, lead ammunition was formally banned from use within the National Park Service. So if you're hunting on a national park land, you cannot use lead. However, there's also this really weird budget rider that's been in the federal budget since 2009, which says you're not allowed to use any federal funding for the investigation or prevention of lead ammunition and fishing tackle, which means even though there's a rule that says you can't use it, you're not allowed to spend any money to enforce that rule, which leads to there's still the use of lead ammunition and fishing tackle on national park lands. In 2017, then Director of Fish and Wildlife, Dan Ash, issued a memo pretty much on his way out the door saying that all lead was going to be phased out from national wildlife refuges. That was January. March of the same year, the next guy came in, Ryan Zinke, and revoked that phase out. And then in 2019, there was this giant piece of legislation in the state of California which bans the use of hunting with lead ammunition. And that was a piece of legislation aimed at helping the California condor. And then in 2021, the Fish and Wildlife Service offered to expand access to hunting and fishing lands within national wildlife refuges. But when they did that, they did not do an environmental impact survey on how it would affect wildlife to have all these new lands now open to hunting and fishing, and therefore potentially lead ammunition. So we'll circle back to that in a minute. Last year at the beginning, the beginning of the year, there was a landmark paper published by Vince Slaby and his colleagues, and it documented population level effects on bald and golden eagles from lead ammunition. And this is significant because, we all have stories. We all know that when a bald or golden eagle ingests lead ammunition, they can feel the effects from it and an individual bird might die. But the federal government and most state governments hold the position that until the entire species population is under threat from something, it's not really worth their time to mitigate it with a law or a rule or a regulation. So this paper last year said lead ammunition alone is a population level threat to bald and golden eagles. It not only can affect individual birds, but it impairs the long-term recovery of a species like the bald eagle. They found it in both live and dead eagles, which means that it is something that can affect them while they're still alive. It's not something that just kills the birds outright. And it was also correlated with hunting seasons. They saw more evidence of lead poisoning after a hunting season when a bird might fly around, eat a gut pile, or eat a carcass of an animal that had been shot with lead and ingest it that way. So in response to that, and in response to the opening of these new lands on national wildlife refuges to hunting and fishing, the Center for Biological Diversity decided to sue the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and was making the assumption that newly opened lands on national wildlife refuges should not be allowed to have lead ammo or fishing tackle used on them. And they basically said that this is a violation of the Endangered Species Act. There might be endangered species on those lands which could be exposed to lead. And by not doing their due diligence and looking at the impacts of lead, the Fish and Wildlife Service had violated the Endangered Species Act. And we will circle back to that as well. So that was one big thing that happened. The other thing that happened was a bunch of individual national wildlife refuges decided to, on their own, phase out lead ammunition and fishing tackle by 2026. There were 11 of them originally. One of them wound up backing out of the original agreement. And so in response to this, there were tons of comments submitted. There was a law introduced in the House and the Senate combating this. And after all these comments were taken under advisement, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service issued these two statements. One, they said population level impacts are not necessary to mitigate a risk from lead. And then at the other time, I'm not going to read through this whole thing, you're welcome to, but basically they said, we know that the approach to lead mitigation has been providing information to anglers and to hunters and hoping that they switch away from lead. And even though there's some anecdotal evidence of that working, it's not working quickly enough. So that's huge. The federal government had never stated that before, but they also did not pair it with a rule to phase out lead. They just said, we know that this is a problem. Let's see how everything else shakes out. So that earlier lawsuit, attacking the Fish and Wildlife Service for not doing the due diligence on the Endangered Species Act, what came out of it was any newly open lands on a national wildlife refuge will not be allowed to have hunting or fishing with lead ammunition occur on them. So if a national wildlife refuge is already open to hunting and fishing, you can still use lead on those lands. If you decide to open another 100 acres or open a refuge that's never been opened before, you're not allowed to use lead products there for hunting or fishing. There are also 8 of the national wildlife refuges from last year that will be proposing an entire refuge phase out of lead. Now, paired alongside this, here's where some of the advocacy work comes in. American Bird Conservancy and the Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility, PEER, sorry, that should all be capitalized. We petitioned the National Park Service to formally ban lead on all of their lands and make it enforceable. We have not yet gotten a response from them. Sometimes it can take 3 to 5 years to get a formal petition response. And then we've also been doing a lot of outreach to state wildlife agencies. I surveyed every state wildlife agency website. I looked at their public-facing pages and tried to find any information about lead toxicity and options for ammunition and tackle that are not lead-based. And of all 50 state wildlife agency websites, only 8 of them currently have anything that's easily accessible, talking about ammunition alternatives and tackle alternatives. Again, we don't want to ban hunting or fishing. We recognize that that is so important. We would just like more information to be provided that talks about this. And why the outreach to the states is important is because a lot of people think that non-lead ammunition and non-lead fishing tackle and the switch to it should be something that is unique to anglers and to hunters. They should decide to do it on their own because we don't want to politicize the issue. But the issue was heavily politicized when H.R. 615 was introduced this year on the floor of the House of Representatives. It is a bill to prohibit the Secretaries of Interior and Agriculture from prohibiting lead on their jurisdictional lands. So if anyone loves a double negative, here's a great one for you. Basically, H.R. 615 would prevent the Secretary of Interior or Agriculture from doing any kind of formal lead regulation, which means that you could not ban lead on national forests, national parks, national wildlife refuges, national monument lands, or Bureau of Land Management jurisdictional lands. This bill has not gone anywhere. It is not a law. It is just sitting in the House of Representatives, but we did issue a formal rebuttal to it, and HMANA was one of the signatories, so we were very grateful to have that support. And why this was important to rebut is because we wanted to make it clear that we are not saying you need to phase out lead on all these lands tonight, even though I personally would like that. But we feel that if the Department of the Interior decided that it wanted to phase out lead, they should have that option. This bill would prohibit that. So we wanted to issue a formal rebuttal. And then here's a gorgeous Aplomado falcon. I love this picture. I didn't take it, but I just think it's great. So shifting gears a little bit to talk about something else highly technical, pesticides are another threat to birds and to wildlife. So we'll start out with something pretty basal, which might seem overly simplistic, but what is a pesticide? Here's the way that the Environmental Protection Agency and the National Pesticide Information Center, which is sort of their informational arm, this is how they define it. Any substance intended for preventing, destroying, repelling, or mitigating any pest. I have heard from my own colleagues at ABC, honestly, before I started working here, that a pesticide is just something that kills bugs. But if you look at this definition, it's really broad. If you have ever bought a citronella candle, you have purchased a pesticide. It is a repelling product. If you have ever put bug spray on yourself, that is a pesticide. There's even been some arguments that say that fly swatters can be construed as a pesticide, but it's a very, very big umbrella, which includes herbicides or chemicals that kill plants, fungicides, insecticides, disinfectants, including antimicrobials. Those are pesticides. So a Clorox wipe is technically a pesticide. Rodenticides, and any repellent. So even though we hear pesticide and we think of, bee and wasp spray, or at least I did, or, something that you go out and that you see farmers spraying, those are pesticides, but it is a really, really wide umbrella. So when we talk about pesticides that birds might interact with, they can be synthetic, they can be things that we're spraying on our lawns. They can be biological. They can be things like essential oils. They are used on our homes. They are used in our recreational facilities like parks and golf courses. And of course, they're used in agriculture. Pesticides are pretty ubiquitous. They are everywhere. And when it comes to regulating pesticides at the federal level, everything comes under this one single law called FIFRA, the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act. It was passed in 1947, and it governs all pesticide regulation and registration, which means if you're a pesticide manufacturer and you want to register a new chemical, all the procedures for how to do that are described in FIFRA. It's also the law that prescribes what needs to go on a pesticide label. And originally, FIFRA was administered by the USDA, the Department of Agriculture. After the EPA was founded in 1970, FIFRA went from being under the USDA to under the EPA. And that might seem subtle, but it's a really important distinction because USDA is there to primarily govern and help farms and farmers. So you can imagine they would have a bigger interest in registering more products. The EPA has environmental protection right there in the name. So we would want them, being over top of what chemicals are safe. And the way that FIFRA works is a little bit different from a lot of other laws. Rather than purely being there to make sure that things are done as safely as possible, FIFRA is actually a cost benefits analysis bill or law. It looks at the cost of human safety and environmental safety and weighs it against the benefits of pest removal. What that means is if a chemical does a lot of environmental damage, but it also is really good for a specific crop, rather than saying, well, this chemical does environmental damage, we need to not register it, FIFRA can say, but if you look at how much damage it does versus the benefit that it's bringing to certain crops, we might want to still allow its use. So it gets a little bit tricky. The way that FIFRA works, it asks things like, what pests are we facing? Will they become resistant to current pesticides? what will yield affordable crops, beautiful grass, things like that. And then in terms of human and environmental safety, they can ask, is it carcinogenic? Will it cause cancer? What are the effects on wildlife? And what are the long-term effects that it might have sitting around in the environment? At least that's how it's supposed to work. Ways that birds can be exposed to pesticides are through ingesting pesticide-laden products like a poisoned mouse or rat, by being exposed, getting it right on their feathers or their skin, or sometimes even interacting with a plant that has been grown with a pesticide. One of the biggest exposure routes for birds, and since this isn't quite as raptor specific, I won't spend a ton of time on it, but one of the big ones is neonicotinoid seed treatments. So neonicotinoids are a systemic insecticide, so they kill bugs. They are meant to be grown into a plant. That's what makes them systemic. They get coated on the outside of a seed or they get sprayed on a plant, and the plant actually absorbs them because they travel really well in water and get grown into the leaves and the fruits and the stems and the pollen and the nectar. That all means you can't wash it off after you buy it at the grocery store, or a big rainstorm isn't going to wash it away. It's literally part of the plant tissue. When neonicotinoids were first introduced, they were this new wonder chemical. They were supposed to be the thing that replaced really nasty chemicals like organophosphates, such as chlorpyrifos. And they were thought to, kind of be the panacea to all of our pest problems, especially pests that might munch on leaves or suck on the stem of a plant, something like that. The top graph here shows that in 1994, neonics were first introduced. And then over the years, their use absolutely skyrocketed. The bottom graph is the use of all other pesticides that do the same thing over the same time period. So what you can see from this is that rather than neonics replacing a lot of other chemicals, they're now just used in addition to them. There was a really interesting study done in the Netherlands where they looked at areas where neonicotinoids were used, and then they looked at the local population of birds, and they found that there was a correlation between bird loss and neonicotinoid use. What was interesting is that it wasn't from the birds eating the neonics. It was from neonics sloughing off of the seeds, running out of the farm fields, getting into the local waterways, and killing all of the invertebrates that lived there. Mayflies, caddisflies, black flies, whatever it might be, all of these insects that birds really heavily rely upon. They are very, very potent. So a single seed coated with a neonic can kill a songbird. It takes just one kernel of corn with a neonic to kill something as big as a cardinal or a thrush. And one seed coated with a neonic has enough active ingredient to kill 80,000 bees. That's a lot of bugs that can be dead from just one seed. And when you think about all the seeds that are planted during a normal crop season, you can see why it's very concerning. And this might seem a little ethereal and not quite related to raptors, but a lot of smaller raptors, a lot of falcons, a lot of smaller hawks are very dependent on insect prey, especially for rearing their chicks. When we lose small passerine species, those are great food sources for things like Cooper's hawks. Some species of owl might even rely upon them. And then, of course, it's just bird loss in general. Biodiversity loss in general has an enormous cascading environmental effect. The trick with neonic-coated seeds is that the United States Geological Survey used to track them. It used to look at how much they were used. So this is a neonic in 2014. This is the map of everywhere it was used in the United States. And then in 2015, they said, you know what, it's really, really hard to track where neonic-coated seeds are used because FIFRA, that law we were talking about earlier, does not define a seed coated with a pesticide as a pesticide. That seems really backwards, but basically what it means is if the chemical's in a jug, it's a pesticide. When the chemical gets put onto a seed, it's no longer a pesticide. It's this other weird thing that you don't have to regulate, you don't have to track, you don't have to report its use, and it's not technically considered an agricultural chemical anymore. So in 2015, the USGS stopped even trying to keep track of them. And so if you look at these two maps, the one on the left is when we were tracking neonic-coated seeds. The one on the right is without tracking neonic seeds. It looks like all these neonics just disappeared overnight, but instead it's just because we stopped counting them. And seed treatments are the number one use of neonicotinoids. The way that I like to think about it is, imagine if you were trying to count all the trees in the United States, but you decided not to count the trees that are in forests. That's about the same way as saying we're going to account for neonics, but we're not going to account for neonics that are used as seeds. So this exemption that allows treated seeds not to be considered pesticides is called the treated article exemption. And in 2017, American Bird Conservancy and a lot of our partners challenged that formally. It took the EPA 5 years and somebody suing them for them to finally respond. And when they did, they decided to deny this petition. They doubled down and said, nope, we are convinced that we are already doing enough. Pesticide-coated seeds are not pesticides. But they did agree to later this year introduce a new set of rules around what goes on the label on a bag of pesticide-coated seeds. It's not much, but it's something. There will be a formal comment period there. We are actively working with EPA on this, and we'll definitely need input from HMANA when that time comes around sometime in September or so. And then this year, ABC and some of our partners also introduced a new petition asking for pesticide registrants, or the companies that make them, to prove that their product works before it goes to market. And you might be scratching your head saying, well, why wouldn't they do that already? That is not currently part of the required process for registering a pesticide. That includes rodenticides. You have to say what chemicals are in it. You have to do a handful of laboratory tests that you then extrapolate impacts on all species from, but you don't have to prove that it works. You don't have to prove that it does what it says it does. That's actually something that's left up to the states. The federal government does not require you to do that, and we would like them to change that. So we submitted this formal petition. There was also a lawsuit brought against a chemical called sulfoxaflor. Basically, what happened is the EPA approved new uses of a chemical that was already on the market, but it did not go through any kind of a public vetting process. They never opened up a comment period. So Earth Justice sued the EPA lost. And what I think is really interesting was this sentence that came out of the court's decision. When an agency deliberately ignores Congress's legislative command, it undermines the will of the people and ultimately our constitutional structure of government. That's some pretty weighty stuff. And what the judge that ruled on this was saying is EPA should not be able to ignore the law. They should not be able to ignore the Endangered Species Act. They should not be able to selectively interpret FIFRA and keep getting away with it, because they have been for a very long time. There was also a chemical called impure fluxum. That is a seed treatment that's a fungicide. It was found to be highly deadly to large-bodied birds, including cranes, swans, and potentially eagles, because it does bioaccumulate. So the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals also reviewed this one and found that the EPA had violated the Endangered Species Act. So you can see a pattern here, right? There's lots of violations of the Endangered Species Act. Oh God, that's a terrible looking slide. I'm so sorry. I don't know why the text got all compressed like that. Basically, without getting too far into the nitty gritty, the current EPA administration really is trying hard to make up for all of the lost time, about 45 years of ignoring federal laws. And what they've done is create a work plan to look at how to comply with the Endangered Species Act better, how to try to introduce rules on all the chemicals that are currently registered, and how to make sure that species get the protections from chemical pesticides that they aren't currently getting. There's a lot of chemicals that they are kind of fast tracking and looking at under a microscope right now. Every single one of these chemicals they are examining because of a lawsuit from a citizen group. This is not necessarily because the EPA wanted to do the right thing. It's because they got sued and they lost every single time. So the other thing that was very significant was the EPA issued an update to this work plan late last year. And in that update, they said, okay, we have roughly 12,000 chemical pesticide products registered on the market right now. only 5% of them have had any considerations for how they affect non-target wildlife. So if it's meant to kill aphids on a crop, most chemicals have not been assessed to see, will this affect hawks? Will this affect vultures? Will this affect fish? If it kills fish, will it affect osprey that rely on the fish to eat? None of that's been done for 95% of chemicals registered in the United States. So the EPA said, we are really sorry. We're doing everything that we can. And what they decided to do was introduce batch mitigations, which means rather than going individual chemical by individual chemical, they want to introduce a set of rules for every fungicide that works in a certain way. Every anticoagulant rodenticide, we're going to set up a basic set of rules, and then we can tweak it individually as we need to. They decided to launch an ESA, Endangered Species Act, pilot program, take a handful of species, design some mitigation, some rules and regulations for those species, and then extrapolate out from those. And they also want to develop national rodenticide, herbicide, and insecticide strategies. And rodenticides is the first one that they're doing. The rodenticide strategy is actually what got me talking with HMANA, because there's the fewest chemicals. There's only 11 registered on the market right now, compared to herbicides, but there's like 8,000 or something insane. So there's only about 11 registered for rodenticides. And EPA is saying, okay, we're going to come up with a national strategy, a single way to look at and try to put rules and barriers around all these chemicals. And they have made it very clear that this work plan and the rules that come out of it are not the end of the line. This is just the beginning. So this is interesting because we want to support this work. We love that the EPA is really trying to do the right thing. They're trying to make up for lost time. They are trying to make sure that species which previous EPAs haven't cared about finally get some consideration. And they're doing it not just for endangered and threatened wildlife, but all non-target wildlife that might be affected by these chemicals. We want to support them, but we don't know how long we're going to have a sympathetic EPA. You know, depending on who wins the next presidential election, who they appoint to the EPA, and how they want to run their agency, this could all go out the window. So we are poking them with a stick as much as we can to try to get this to go the way that we think it should. So we're providing a lot of feedback. So to talk a little bit more about this species project and the rodenticide proposed interim decision, this national rodenticide strategy, the way that EPA is having it work is they said, okay, we're going to look at rodenticides. We're going to look at a list of endangered species, and we're going to pick a few that we think will be affected by rodenticides right now. And the three that they went with were the Stevens kangaroo rat, because they're a rodent, they're an animal that might eat a rodenticide. The Atwater's prairie chicken, because they live in areas where rodenticides might be used, they feed on agricultural fields. And the California condor, because they eat stuff that might have eaten a rodenticide, so they could get exposed that way. And the EPA wrote a bunch of rules on how to, protect Stevens kangaroo rats, prairie chickens, and California condors from rodenticides. And their thought is that the next time that a rodenticide chemical is getting reviewed or a new one is getting introduced, so if Kern Pesticide Company decides to design a new rodenticide, we want to put it on the market, the EPA can say, okay, we wrote these rules for condors for a different rodenticide. Your chemical is going to have to be subject to every single one of these rules up front. And then if we need to tweak it later on, we will. That's huge, because the way it works right now is we're not going to put any new rules or regulations on it. And then down the line, if you can prove that it's hurting wildlife, then we'll think about putting some rules around it. But we have to consult with the states. It has to be consulted with outside experts, and the Fish and Wildlife Service has to formally do a consultation. So EPA is taking all the rules that usually happen way over here down the line and smacking them up front. And that's what we love to see. So they have designed this for rodenticides. Next, they'll be doing it for herbicides. And then they save the big guy for last, which is insecticides. One of the other issue areas that we're looking at is the growth of crops on national wildlife refuges, which is normally done to feed ducks and geese and other migratory waterfowl. there is a lot of chemical use on national wildlife refuges just for growing crops. So we are hoping to kind of amend that a little bit and make it a lot harder to use chemicals just for growing corn and soybeans. And that's a little bit of a fraud issue, and I'm happy to get into that more offline if anyone's very interested, because we did also support a petition that was specifically addressing this. So I could go on and on and on about these issues and what we're working on. But the more important thing, the more exciting thing is to think about what we can do going forward. There are legislative solutions. There are state and federal bills that are built to protect wildlife from chemical pesticides. Most big decisions that we were talking about earlier, though, that the agencies are undertaking are driven by lawsuits from citizen groups. They're driven by lawsuits from beekeepers, from bird watchers, from groups that have data sets that come from hawk watches, that come from Audubon societies, that come from bird clubs. Formal commenting procedures are powerful. When the EPA, when Fish and Wildlife says, what do you think about this rule? Anyone can comment on it. Like I said, as long as it's substantive, they legally have to review it. And what I mean by that is you can't log in and say, hi, I'm Dave, and you're all terrible and you smell bad. The EPA doesn't have to consider that when they're writing a rule. If you have a lot of data and papers you can cite, things like that, they do have to consider those. And there's more action now going on chemicals, on lead, than there ever has been before. So this is the time to get involved and get engaged. So what you can do as an individual or as a member of HMANA, talk to your legislators, your state legislators, your senators, your representatives, your governor. Let them know that this is something you're concerned about. Something that I found very surprising when I started doing this work is, you don't have to type in the chat, but just in your head, how many calls do you think a representative has to get before they consider an issue high priority? I would have assumed it's 1,000, 2,000, something like that. It's 4. If a legislator gets 4 calls from citizens, that is considered a high priority. That's something that they will then start paying more attention to. So if it's 10 calls, it's even more than that. If it's 10 letters, it's, that much more attention. Sign on to letters that activist groups are already writing. Write your own if you want to. At home, avoid personal use of chemical rodenticides and chemical pesticides as much as possible. I'm not saying I think that you should live in a house that's infested by rats. I'm not saying watch your beautiful garden that you've kept up for 30 years completely go to the wind, but look at some non-chemical options or some less harmful chemical options. And citizen science works. Data gathered by Hawkwatch, things endorsed by HMANA, work. This is where all of this comes from. All that lead toxicity stuff I was talking about earlier, most of that data came from wildlife rehabilitation centers that are not run by state governments or agencies, that are not funded by the federal government. That's what's driving change. It's all of you, the interest that you have in the work that you're doing. So that was a lot. That was a lot of technical stuff. I will end it there. My email's at the bottom. Please feel free to contact me afterwards. And if we have any questions, I'm happy to take a few.
Great. All right. Wow. Thank you, Hardy. That was a lot of information.
It was
really, really useful. You covered a lot, and thank you for breaking things down in the way you did. You kind of made these issues more understandable, easy to digest, and some of those bills easier to understand. So thank you.
Yeah.
It must be really frustrating at times, I can imagine, doing the work you're doing. It's so important, and we're so happy you're doing it. But it must be hard to stay hopeful at times. I mean, you're getting some wins and you're seeing some progress. So that must really keep you going, I'm sure.
Absolutely. It's all about the small wins, and it's about, staying strong, staying tenacious. I've been doing this work for about 1.5 years now. My boss, Steve Holmer at ABC, has been a bird advocate and been doing bird policy work for 20 some years. So days where, I start to feel a little downtrodden or something like that, I look at him and I'm like, okay, I can't talk quite yet. But yeah, it makes those small wins, those group efforts that much sweeter and that much better.
Yep. That's great. Yeah, you definitely have to be patient. As you said, there could be 3 to 5 years hearing back from a petition response. That blew my mind.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, we do have a few questions coming in from people. Gordon is wondering, how are other countries doing with pesticides? Are the U.S. Rules essentially wasted by the actions or inactions of other jurisdictions?
Great question, Gordon. So the EU in general, the European Union, is light years ahead of the United States with this. They have already banned the use of neonicotinoids. Most member countries have very strict rules on anticoagulant rodenticides. They're actually getting ready to ban lead ammunition for wildlife takes, so hunting across the entire EU. Canada is, our neighbor to the north. They're stricter. They tend to do things more by province. So Quebec has some very, very restrictive pesticide use laws. New Brunswick, not so much. So it's kind of, area by area. And then other countries and other continents, Australia, very, very restrictive on lead use, not so much on pesticide use, but they don't do a ton of crop agriculture in Australia compared to other industries. And then some of the US laws are designed so that US crop growers don't have to be as restrictive with pesticides because we rely on the country importing our produce to have their own laws in place. And a really great illustration is there's a chemical called chlorpyrifos, which is an organophosphate. It's highly deadly to hawks. It's very deadly to small falcons like kestrels and peregrines. It's really, really bad for insects and for people. It's actually linked to Parkinson's disease. Last year, the EPA banned its use if you're growing a crop that is going to be sold and eaten in the United States. But if we're exporting it, you're still allowed to use chlorpyrifos. So we're relying on countries importing our crops to have their own rules in place, many of which don't. So they're definitely not wasted. I would say that we are ahead of some countries in some parts of the world and light years behind other, what I would call environmentally conscious nations or continents even.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, everything you're saying about these seed treatments it's so worrisome. And the way we're not tracking it as closely. Yvonne is wondering how you can find out if seeds you're buying, like flower seeds, have neonics, have been treated with neonics.
Sure. Excellent question. So if you are coating a seed with a neonicotinoid, by law, the one thing that's good is you have to make it a bright, unnatural color. So let me go back here to that slide. So this pile of looks like Skittles, that is neonicotinoid coated seeds. So they really stick out. They are made these really awkward, weird pastel colors. You are not legally allowed to sell a neonicotinoid coated seed as human or animal food. And it's very unlikely that a flower seed you're buying at your local garden or hardware store has a neonic on it. If it does, it's probably like a little bit of contamination, but not enough to where you need to be concerned. The other question we get a lot is, do I need to be worried about bird seed that I'm buying? Does that have a neonic on it? And the little bit of testing that's been done says that, if you're buying black oil sunflower seeds, we'll say, if they came from a sunflower that was grown with a neonic coating, there are trace amounts of neonics in the seeds you're buying at the store, but not enough to negatively harm birds. That's what the current research shows. That may change, but what I'm trying to say is you don't have to worry about going to Wild Birds Unlimited and buying a bag of bird food from there. You're not going to be exposing birds in your backyard to seeds. So the biggest thing to ask, though, is did the plants that I'm buying at Lowe's or Home Depot or whatever, were they grown with a neonic? That is something that the stores might be able to answer. And it's always more expensive, but if you can buy organic, buy organic.
Right. I was going to follow up with that question. I do see that they have to put labels on those plants now, right? At like Lowe's and Home Depot. That's usually where I see that labeling.
Yeah, they're encouraged to. It's not law yet, but Home Depot is actually pretty good about it. So read the label as much as you can.
Yeah, great. Lori is asking what the chances are of banning neonics like in Europe.
Banning them, very unlikely. Getting them under a different jurisdiction so that they can be better regulated and better tracked, that is actually pretty likely. I think in the next 3 years or so, that's what's going to happen. It's already on the table in a handful of different states. The other thing that's happening with neonics right now is we're more and more finding that they don't really work the way that we want them to. There are certain crop pests like corn rootworms, which are really only active in the Midwest, the northern Midwest, and then parts of the Southeast. Neonics do work really well against them. If you're a soybean grower or a corn farmer in Nebraska, you're not getting any benefit from neonics. And there have been study after study after study that concludes that. So you do have to pay more for seed treatments if you're a grower. So logically, you're paying more for something that harms the environment and isn't even benefiting you as a grower. And I think that's where we're really going to see progress. I don't think we're going to have a law that bans neonics. I don't think the EPA is going to ban neonics. I do think we're going to see a lot more restrictions and regulations put in place to where it's going to be such a pain in the butt to try to use them that most growers aren't going to want to. And sometimes, that's how you declare a win and depart the field.
Okay. Fran and Dennis are wondering, can you repeat what toxins are related to Parkinson's disease?
Yes. So there's early evidence that neonicotinoids are linked to it, but that's very early evidence. There's a chemical called chlorpyrifos, chlorpyrifos. That's an organophosphate, and that is linked to Parkinson's. There's another one called paraquat, Paraquat, and that has also been linked to neurodegenerative diseases in humans. It's particularly bad for pregnant women.
Okay. Another question here from Yvonne. She says, are neonics used in rice production in the US and elsewhere?
Yes, they are. Great question, Yvonne. They are used in rice production, mostly in California and parts of the Pacific Northwest where there's a lot of rice crop.
Okay, great. And do you have an area on the ABC website where we can get some of this information? I was interested specifically in just seeing some of your, you said your reach is North and South America, Central America. Do you have a place on your website that talks about all the different research you're doing in areas you have staff?
We do, yeah. So if you go to abcbirds.org, there is the two best pages for that are the threats and solutions pages. And then there's also a whole section about our field work. We also have an area where you can sign up just to receive information about, upcoming webinars and stuff that we have. We actually have a webinar coming up next week about habitat protection and following migratory birds to where they go in the winter, because I think it's so interesting. All of these backyard birds, if we think about, they overwinter in these beautiful tropical places where a warbler or a thrush looks completely out of place. So I can send you the link to that. And if it's appropriate to share it with HMANA supporters, you're welcome to.
Sure, that would be great. Thank you. I think that wraps up the questions, unless anybody has any last minute ones, but that was just fabulous. I definitely learned a lot, and I have a lot to think about. Can be totally discouraging, but yeah. I'm definitely hopeful. With and there's a lot we can do, and that we are doing, that bird lovers are doing. So that's encouraging for sure.
Definitely, that's more than the doom and gloom of it. I hope that everyone takes away that this is something that's changing. This is something that's getting a lot of attention. This is something that we are having a positive impact on, and it's not forever. It's reversible. It's human caused, which means that there's a human solution, and that's the exciting part. Exactly. Also, birds are awesome, and regardless of how you feel about anything else, birds are fantastic. Everyone's on board with helping birds some way or another. Even that's right. My mother is terrified of birds, and she's very supportive of my work. So it's out there.
That's such a funny fear. I know several people with that phobia.
Yeah.
Well, one last question just came in from Steve.
Yeah.
He said, should we assume that organic seeds and crops are free of neonics then?
Yes, you can be sure of that. By current National Organic Standards Board requirements, they have to be free of neonics. And there's actually, I mean, it's even to the point where if you're an organic grower and you're growing crops and they get damaged by pesticides used in the field next to yours, you are no longer allowed to sell your food as organic by legal requirement. So if it says organic, as far as we know right now, yeah, you're very safe from all of that.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Hardy. Thank you for this great presentation. A lot of wonderful comments coming in from people who appreciated this presentation. And thanks for all that you do. As Josh mentioned earlier, we do have our next month. Our Lunch and Learn is going to be by Scott Harris. He's going to be, that's going to be May 24th. I don't think we wrote the date on that. May 24th. And he's going to be speaking about his adventures chasing 55 different raptor species across 34 states. And it's his version of a raptor big year. So that's happening next month. You can register for that on our Facebook page or on our website at HMANA.org. Josh mentioned that we do have an upcoming tour to Belize that's filling up. So if you're interested, you can check that out on the HMANA website. And we always welcome your support in all the programming and outreach education that we do. And you can do that with a donation or becoming a HMANA member. And you can visit HMANA.org/support. And it's Raptor-a-thon season, as Josh mentioned. So that's a great way to show your support, whether you want to, even if you don't want to do a Raptor-a-thon event yourself, you can always support a team online. There's lots of teams to support. And yeah, I think that's it for this month. Does anybody, Josh, do you have any closing comments you want to add? Nope. Well, my dog is adding some closing comments there. He said that he really appreciated the talk as well. So thank you, everybody, for joining us. And we'll hopefully see you next month. Thanks again, Hardy.